We are going to go through the different controls within our randomizer application and take a look and see what code is necessary to make this do what it does. So at the beginning of this tutorial, I asked you to go through a couple of steps to create the random number generator. So we'll look at those first briefly. The first thing we did was create a property, and that property was called myRandom. That's what I'm using as my variable to create the random numbers. It was set as an integer, and it is a public variable. After we did that, I asked you to create a method. So the method that we created from our pull-down menu was generateRandomNumber, and that is the class method that is placed within XOJO. So we're telling it then to create a random number, and that random number that is created will be within the range of 1 to 10. So it can select any number from 1 to 10, and that is going to be stored as the variable name that we created, myRandom. So with those two steps out of the way, it's time to start to add some code to our controls. And as you saw in the build, I have 10 labels that are representing the numbers 1 to 10. None of those have any code in them. I also have a label on the bottom of my screen telling me what this text box is going to do. This label has no code in it either. But I do have a push button that is this start button, and it does have code in it. So I'm going to take a look at that code, and what that button does is it takes all of the labels and it makes them all visible. So this start button is acting as a start button and a restart button. So you can use it to play the game multiple times in a row. So when I click that button, L1.visible equals true, so that's saying label 1, which contains number 1, will be visible, and that same code occurs for all 10 of my labels. So they will all show up across the top of my screen, and then I'm simply turning the timer on, so the timer will start to run its code. And that is simply timer1.mode, and this is the name of the timer here, equals timer.mode multiple. Now if we go back to our timer, and we look at its behavior, it is currently set to being off, which means it will not do its coding until I click the start button. And again, the start button changes the mode from off to multiple. And I have the period set to 1000, which means every second the timer will do its thing, whatever it is coded to do. So again, that period is expressed in milliseconds. 1000 milliseconds equals 1 second. So every second the timer will do what it is programmed to do. So if we look at the action in the timer, you're going to see a fair bit of code here. And it's really not that complicated, but we'll take a quick look at it here. So when I have the timer displaying my random number, I need to tell it to generate a random number, and display.text is going to print in it the string value of myRandom. Now remember that we created myRandom as an integer, so to print an integer into a text box, you need to convert it back into a string, hence the str. So this text box here then will show every second the random number generated between 1 and 10. Now I have a whole series of if-then statements, and again these are pretty straightforward. What I'm saying is if the random number equals 1, then the label that is named L1, which contains the number 1, will disappear. So its visible becomes false, it disappears. So if I jump back to my window, you've seen this in operation. The random number generator pulls out a 2, text box 2 will become invisible by turning its visible property to false. So back to our timer, I have that same bit of code for every one of my labels. And again, they are all labeled L7, L8, L9, which stands for label 7, label 8, label 9, and they hold that corresponding number as their text caption. So that takes care of all of the numbers disappearing. Score text.text. Now we'll jump back and take a look at what score text.text is. That is this text box right here. And again, it counts how many different random numbers have been generated, and it will continue to count those until these all disappear. So back to my code for my timer. Score text.text. Now this gets a little confusing here. what I'm doing in there is simply counting the instances of the timer doing its thing. So every second, it is adding 1 to the value of that text box. So score text.text starts with a value of 0. And I'm going to show you how that occurs in just a second. So that value of whatever is in that text box, and there's the little switch to make it a value, is going to be increased by 1 every second because this timer is running its code every second. So this score text starts at 0. After 1 second it is 1. After 2 seconds it is 2. And it keeps doing that, and it prints that value back into my text box. Now remember, you can't print an integer into your text box without turning it back into a string. So essentially what I've got here is a string that's being converted to a value. We're adding to it, and then we're turning it back into a string and printing it into this text box. So let me jump back out of that for a second. I will go to my window, and I'm going to show you that when I click on this text box, if I scroll down through my inspector properties, I can set the initial state of that to be a 0. So that means it'll take that 0, which is a string, convert it to a value, start to add to it, and then turn it back into a string to print it back into the text box. Back to my code. Now this last little bit of code is what actually stops the whole application. So I'm doing an if-then check to see if the visible character or property of every one of those labels is false. So as they disappear, their visible property is set from true to false. They become invisible, and I've used an AND statement to tie that all together. So if L1.visible equals false, and L2.visible equals false, and L3.visible equals false, and I continue all the way down that, putting it all together with my AND statements. So if all 10 of my labels are false, that means the randomized timer has picked all 10 numbers, and at that point in time, I turn the timer off. Timer1.mode equals timer.mode off. So the timer turns itself off, and the game finishes. So at that point in time then my text box will display how many times the timer had to run through its random generator in order to generate random numbers between 1 and 10 inclusive. So that's getting at least 1 of each number. So there's all my code. You have my method to generate the random number. You have the property to create the public variable myRandom, which holds the random number. You then have the push button, which will do two things: turn all of the labels back on and activate the timer, and then you have your timer, which is generating the random number and displaying it in the display text box, eliminating numbers as they are picked, counting how many times the random number generator does its thing, and then shutting itself off when all of the numbers between 1 and 10 have been picked at least once. Okay, so there's the code. You can take a look at that at any time with the video, move back and forth, make sure you get it coded properly. There's the code for my button. And of course you have your method to create the class random timer and your property to create the public integer variable called myRandom, which will hold your random number. Okay, good luck with that.